Thank you, Daikalia. I'm going to really just put out some ideas. I'm too new at a very old organization. I noticed that it is the oldest think tank in the group of think tanks that are here. It's 56 years on that it was established. It's also one of the largest. And I'm too new to talk at great length or at great depth about this institution. I will refer to some of the features of this institution, but just to perhaps indicate that from the very beginning, long before the phrase was invented, NCAER was an experiment in a public-private partnership. So in the initial founding fathers, you had the finance minister, the Commerce and Industries Minister, the chairman, the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, but you also had India's largest and most prominent industrialist, J.R.D. Tata, from the House of Tatas. You also had the CEO of the largest MNC in 1956, that was Burma Shell, and you had members of parliament who were prominent economists. So a very unusual public-private partnership that seems to have survived the test of time. With that background, I really want to talk about two or three things. One, perhaps the similarity between and the differences between for-profits and think tanks. And think tanks are a species of non-profits with a very specific mandate and a public good aspect of what they do. So I'm going to draw some similarities and some differences because so much of our thinking about what boards do or don't is conditioned by either our knowledge of what for-profits do in their boards or the kind of losses or gains we've made on the stock market as the boards of companies we own a share of have done their job or haven't. So I want to draw on some similarities and some distinctions, and then I want to focus a little bit on what the meaning of accountability for think tanks might mean and how boards can contribute positively, and I think as Maureen hinted, when boards become millstones, negatively to accountability. And then I want to touch upon one of the findings of Daikalia's little research into all of us, and particularly focus on the issue of resource mobilization that seems not to be on the agenda of many think tanks in terms of what their boards do. And finally, because that was part of the mandate, I'll just throw out some pointers for what might be some good ways of thinking about boards. But these are just very practical things like the composition of the board and whom might you want on that board for what reason. So first, thinking about the similarities between for-profits and think tanks. We all need financial sustenance and sustainability to power our dreams and our vision. And in that respect, as my distinguished panelists here have pointed out, good management and leadership really do matter. They matter because think tanks need to deliver, they need to motivate and inspire their staff, they need to set new directions, they need to know how to change direction. They need to think about budgets, managing budgets, about measuring performance in a very difficult space. So in many ways, these are very common things that leadership and good management involve in both profits and non-profits. What are some of the differences? I think there is a presumption that for-profit organizations are really focused on very tangible, hard metrics like profit, market capitalization. But one often forgets that even for-profits have to do a lot of organizational capacity building. Venture capital is actually nothing but an exercise in making the right investments, in growing a company, eventually being able to cash out on that company when it has achieved a market valuation, a market presence, a scale, such as, for example, Mark Zuckerberg just demonstrated in taking Facebook to the market and making many, many billionaires around the world. So we often forget that for-profits, while they may have very clean metrics to work with, also have very complex tasks of capacity building and organizational behavior. And one of the major lessons that I think we can derive from how for-profit boards work has to do with the mating of capacity building and performance management. If you cannot measure what you are trying to do, then it is very difficult to be able to understand or gauge or modulate capacity building. You may be building capacity in exactly the wrong direction, and there is the history of for-profits is strewn with the deaths of many companies who build capacity in the wrong product, the wrong market, the wrong kind of service. And so I think think tanks also need to be worried about this relationship between performance management, measurement, and capacity building. I'll come back to that briefly. The second challenge, I think, in thinking about for-profits and non-profits is the very different alignment of stakeholders in the two situations. And so this is a real difference. In the case of a for-profit, or when you're a business, you have a customer who's paying for a product that generates revenues for the firm, which ultimately generates values for the shareholders and the owners of the company. So the interests of the customer, the firm, and the owners becomes aligned when somebody is willing to actually pay for a service or a product. In the case of think tanks and non-profits, people who pay for the work of the think tank, and these are foundations, donors, governments, are usually different from the people who benefit from the work of the think tank. And there are, of course, some exceptions. My institution is an exception. A bulk of our revenues come from serving contract research needs of clients. But by and large, think tanks are doing things for people, for society, for individuals and groups that are very different from those who are paying for those services. And that creates a huge gap that needs to be filled by the institution, by its CEO, and indeed by its board. So it also creates opportunities and challenges. Opportunities for building that bridge between the mission of the think tank and the ultimate stakeholders, the people who are paying for the think tank in some ways. But it can also create opportunities for dissonance. And having served, having sort of been on both sides of the table, I spent a few years at the Ford Foundation doing a lot of grant making, and after 25 years in the World Bank, lending a lot of money and making a lot of grants. There is always the potential, because of this misalignment between who's paying for it and who's benefiting from it, for boards and for CEOs to potentially lean too much towards the wishes and desires of the donors. And that's a challenge both for the recipients of grants and the givers of grants, to ensure that the mission of the organization is not being compromised by the short-term needs. I used to be a program officer myself, and I know what it means to be successful in a grant-giving organization. That success may not match exactly what the foundation, what the recipient of the grant or the think tank ought to be doing, true to its own memorandum of association, true to its own mission. So there's both an opportunity as well as a potential for misaligning and misdirecting the mission of a think tank. So we need to be aware of, I think, this kind of a distinction between for-profits and non-profits. And the third and final issue I just wanted to touch upon, there are a whole range of other differences between for-profits and think tanks, but a third issue is the difference between financial and the kind of performance metrics that we have to deal with in think tanks. In the for-profit world, we have a generally agreed upon set of metrics that are usually backward-looking, share price, market capitalization. These are the more forward-looking aspects of a firm, but essentially it's the last quarter's results that determine how markets view the performance of a firm. In our case, metrics become very, very difficult. As you think about the theory of change in some ways that we are all subscribing to, because we are, as Nancy Birdsall said in the morning, here to produce change at some level, whether in hearts, minds, institutions, processes, but we are here, think tanks are essentially about change. And how to measure that change and what theory of change powers our own thinking is very important. And you need to mate that theory of change with the organizational strategy of how you're going about producing that change. And it leads to a whole variety of possibilities, from what's most desirable in terms of a change in the entire ecosystem to less ambitious institutional changes, to perhaps even less ambitious integrated kind of changes in, say, service delivery in health or education, to some very niche outcomes or outputs where we are trying to tackle a very small problem. So I think a whole range of measurement issues come to the fore, and I think we need to be very conscious in thinking about how we are managed, how think tanks have boards, and how boards need to be educated about some of these differences. Many of our boards, and certainly the case with NCAER, have private sector representatives. My board actually has perhaps a very large chunk of the corporate big weights in India, from the Ambanis to most of the major corporations. We happen to have, as a president of our board, the chairman of our board, the managing director of one of India's best-known IT companies, and now no longer with that company. So these are people who come from a for-profit making world. They are there for their wisdom, their experience, their ability to grow institutions, to be able to dipstick markets and understand what markets are telling them, to transform that for-profit knowledge, wisdom, huge experience into the non-profit world is a challenge, but also a tremendous opportunity, because you can bring to bear all that collective wisdom to the strategy, the growth, the kinds of things that non-profits and think tanks do. Let me turn then to the sort of second set of ideas of what I wanted to put forward, which I hope we can pick up in the group work and in the discussion. Accountability for what? What should think tanks be accountable for, and what should boards in that respect mediate when they think about holding themselves and their institutions accountable? I think of four different ways of cutting this. One is financial, and that's obvious. We need to be worried about, boards need to be worried about how the institutions are coping, how they are positioned for the future, what uncertainties they face, and you should never surprise the board. The board should have adequate warning. So clearly this is an important function. Second, and perhaps one of the more important ones, is organizational governance. And I think there are 3 or 4 ways of thinking about this. One has to do with the notion of care. And by that I mean that board members and governing bodies have to be extremely careful that they are getting and requesting the right kind of information from the CEO and from the institution that allows them to make the right decisions, because bad information means bad decisions. So I think this concern for care is very important. Second, I think loyalty. Loyalty in the sense of, is this institution and are the officers of this institution putting the institution first and themselves second? And this most easily translates into thinking about conflicts of interest. Are conflicts of interest being addressed, and perceptions of conflicts of interest being addressed? So I think this is a very important sense of loyalty to the institution that I think boards need to be thinking about. Third, performance. We've already spoken about the difficulty of performance management for think tanks, but boards have to be engaged in this process, particularly if they come from the for-profit sector particularly if they come from government, because many of us have government members on our boards. They bring a completely different way of thinking, a completely different way of behaving, of performing, of allegiance, of bureaucracy, of hierarchy that may not work well for a think tank, knowledge-based governing body. But it is an important thing that we need to, and the point I made earlier about linking performance measurement to capacity building is very important, and being able to link performance measurement to the strategy and the strategic adaptiveness of the institution is very important. Finally, and I think most importantly, something that is not spoken of enough is, I think, the ability of the board to fully take on board the mission of the organization. This is something that really does need to be addressed almost in the same way as when school starts in the morning. There is a school prayer, or there is a school anthem, or there is some sort of repetition of what this whole body is all about. And it's very important to reiterate that again and again, because very often board members will have ideas that really digress from the mission of the organization. If it gets too far, the process can become difficult to unwind and can be extremely painful for not just the board, but the CEO and ultimately the staff of the organization. Third, let me come to the third point, which was very much in the slides that Daikalia very kindly showed in the beginning, this issue of resource mobilization. Given my limited acquaintance as yet, as I'm learning, with the functioning of our own governing body, as NCAER calls it, I think this is a function of boards that hasn't been looked at carefully enough, and certainly the data seem to indicate that. But that's a very important function, because that's when the rubber hits the road. If board members can think of themselves as ambassadors for the institution that they represent and can actually convert it into a market acceptance, whether it's the market for foundations, the market for private philanthropists, for rich men and women who are thinking of ways in which they can pay back to society. They're thinking of the diaspora in richer societies. They may want to contribute back to their own country. So in all these ways, if board members can become generators of cash, of endowments, of grant support for their institutions, it's really putting them to the test. And for me, that's almost a litmus test that must be met. Board members are there for a purpose. And when you go to institutions like Brookings, or indeed even Nancy's own institution, that's a very carefully honed process. You know, you're a board member at a certain level with a certain amount of giving. You have other rings around that, international advisory committees, others, each of which has a certain minimum price that you must be willing to pay. And people aren't willing to pay unless they actually have a meaningful role to perform. So I think bringing that thinking into boards is a development that probably isn't very pervasive amongst our community, but needs to be thought through. Indeed, one of the things that I was considering and thinking about at the breakfast that several members of the heads of the institutions had this morning, the question of what happens after TTI. What if you don't get the second round of TTI support? Well, that is something that should be concerning board members today. And CEOs should be putting up a strategy for dealing with that. And that really does mean going out and raising funds for the institution. I'm coming to the end of my time, so let me just very quickly end with a few things that I have learned and picked up in the year that I have been at NCAER, but it goes back to my foundation days and also goes back to my years at the World Bank. Expertise on the board. An extremely wise thing to do is to look for a public-minded, highly intelligent, highly responsive legal mind that can be on your board. Having a good lawyer, a public lawyer, public interest lawyer perhaps, is an excellent idea, because very often proposals that are being mooted at the board either need to take wing and fly, or the wings need to be clipped right away, and the idea needs to be buried. And having legal presence on the board is extremely valuable in just quickly saying, look, that is A, illegal, B, it's going to attract the taxman who will say that you're doing things that are very close to the border of for-profit, so worry about this, please. And having that advice at that board level is immensely valuable to the chair of the board, to the CEO, to the others, rather than going out to a law firm and paying $50,000 to get legal opinion on something which you would have probably not wanted to pursue had you known where you were going. Second, I think a chartered accountant or a CPA, somebody who knows finance extremely well. I'm very fortunate in having the CEOs of some of the largest companies in India on my board, and it's in their DNA. So for them, it's very easy to see when NCAER is trying to fudge the numbers. So we never try to fudge the numbers. But having a good accounting presence, a good financial analyst, strategist on your board is a wise thing to do, because they're on your side. And they both keep your feet to the fire, but also can look to the future and look to trends and look to what's happening in the economy as a whole, and can guide members of the governing body. There are a whole range of such minor things that one can think about. Certainly, I think boards are an immensely valuable protective device for think tanks. That's the function that they should serve. But they can be really a catalyst for change. And in my case, I know that the kind of rejuvenation strategy for NCAER that's going to be working at 3 or 4 different levels: the human capital of NCAER, the social capital of NCAER, the physical capital of NCAER, and ultimately the financial capital of NCAER, is immensely dependent on the goodwill, the interest, the willingness of several board subcommittees to actually shoulder the burden, to actually have metrics set for them. So I have targets for the finance subcommittee about how many $1 million they need to raise over what period of time. And they will then be actually measured on their performance. That's the accountability of the board to the institution. So I think there's a great scope for bringing professionalism into both how the institution relates to the board, and then how the board relates to the institution, and ultimately how both of them relate to the society that they are really mandated to serve. With that, let me stop. Thank you very much.